I guess I better put my songbook away. Oh, did you have a nice trip? Shabbat Shalom, everyone, and greetings to the people on the Outreach Ministry. Shema Israel, Yahweh Eloheinu, Yahweh Echad, v'ahavto et Yahweh Elohecha, b'kol lavaveka, uvkol nafasheka, uvkol ma'odeka. Hear, O Israel, Yahweh is our Elohim, Yahweh is one, and you shall love Yahweh your Elohim with all your heart, with all your being, and with all your resources. Okay. And I have lost page 1. How'd that happen? Bring me a copy. There's another copy. There's some more copies there. There are some more copies back there. I just need page 1 here. Okay, today I want to talk about a phenomenon that will occur beginning in April of this year that has a lot of people in the Messianic world and in Christianity, especially if they are rapture people, all astir. This is an occurrence that happens very rarely, and because they say it has occurred 3 times around major events in Israel, when the first eclipse, we're talking about eclipses of the moon now, total eclipse, when the first of 4 total eclipses that are exactly 6 lunations or 6 cycles of the moon apart, which means then the second one will occur on the Feast of Tabernacles, if the first one is on Passover. And then 6 months after that, if it's a normal year, you'll have at Passover a 3rd eclipse, and at Tabernacles the next year a 4th. So this cycle is going to be happening to us this year, 2014, and next year, 2015. And so it rarely happens, and these 3 times that they point out revolve around major events that happened in Israel or for the Jewish people. So they say, because they can tie it to these 3 events, it should be a forecast of things to come for Israel. The event is called a tetrad, and it involves these 4 lunar eclipses 6 months or lunar cycles apart, okay? Now, some people call it the blood moon, because when you have a total eclipse, and a blood moon doesn't just take place when you have a tetrad, because there are any number, there are eclipses almost every year. Eclipses of the sun, the moon, and so forth. And whenever you have a total eclipse of the moon, the moon's going to look like it's going to be red, because there's only a certain amount of light that's going to bend around the earth that's going to light up the moon, because it's always at a full moon. And so you're going to have a red color because of the Earth's atmosphere bending certain light lengths, color lengths in the light. So they call it a blood moon. The real definition of a blood moon, if you look it up though, is a hunter's moon that occurs on the full moon after a harvest moon. How many of you have seen a red moon? Not at the time of an eclipse, right? Just a red moon, made red because of the way the light is going through the Earth's atmosphere before it reaches the moon from the sun, and it bends those color waves. Well, that's a true blood moon. It's called a hunter's moon, and it follows. And it has nothing to do with an eclipse. But it just so happens that when you have a total eclipse, you also have the red color, and so they're focusing on this blood moon, and we're going to see that that's significant as far as their predictions and scriptural prophecy is concerned. Now, since the time of Messiah, there have been 3 tetrads that these certain Christians like to focus on because they coincide with the proximity of major events associated with Jews. Okay, so let me tell you what they are. In 1492, the king and queen of Spain, they were actually king and queen of different parts of Spain, but they had married, and so they were bringing the country together. But they didn't like the Jews very well. And of course, this is a time of an inquisition that they got permission from the Pope to carry out against the Jewish people. And so they made a decree in 1492. Does that ring any bells in history with you? We learned the rhyme, didn't we, in grade school? Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492. Yeah, and Doris just named the 3 ships he sailed with. Okay, and Columbus was sent by the king and queen, Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand, I believe it was, of Spain. So 1492, they made a decree that all Jews who refused to convert to Catholicism would have to leave the country. So this is a decree of the expulsion of Jews from Spain. So that's where a lot of Sephardic Jews came to be in South America and in this country and so forth. Okay. And the next year, not that year, not 1492, mind you, but 1493 was the beginning of a tetrad which started on the Feast of Passover, 1492, 1493, the year after the decree, 1493. So 1493, at Passover, there was a total eclipse of the moon, and there was another one at Tabernacles, and 6 months later, there was another one a little early for Passover, but around the equinox. And then 6 months later, there was another one, a little early for Tabernacles. But they say it was Passover and Tabernacles again. And so there's a major event that occurred that affected the Jewish people. Now, 3, and this is where it gets really kind of interesting. 3 of the 4 eclipses were seen in Spain, or could have been seen in Spain, but not the 4th one. Now, who would this sign have been for? It would have been for the king and queen of Spain, wouldn't it? I mean, the blood moon, it's warning. It's saying, look, you did this nasty thing. Shame on you. And so Yahweh, their G-O-D, is going to turn the moon to blood. Because they had some of these scriptures that we're going to read a little bit later about when does the moon turn to blood. Okay? And so they saw 3 of the 4. I wonder if they stayed up at night to watch them. You know, an eclipse is not visible all over the face of the earth. You realize that there are lots of eclipses that we don't see that people in other parts of the world see. Now, I thought when I first looked at this data, in fact, in your notes, it says that they saw all 4, but they didn't. They only saw 3 of the 4. If this is a sign, and this is what they say, this is a billboard from Yahweh, if this is a billboard from Yahweh, I think he's sending a mixed signal here. And maybe that's why King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella didn't do anything. They didn't change anything in their lives because they didn't understand it as a sign. Now, let's go on. In 1948, the Jews were given a homeland in Palestine, right? Everybody recognizes that. That's a pretty historical fact. And the tetrad began at Passover again in 1949, the next year, and ended with a total eclipse in 1950 at Tabernacles. All four of these eclipses were visible, not necessarily the total part of it, but all four eclipses were visible in Jerusalem. Interesting, huh? But it was the year after 1948, when Israel was fighting a war. I don't think that affected anything the way anybody fought those wars. I don't think anybody really thought much about them. Because, they're eclipses of the moon, which happen, there are, I've got a chart here, you can look this up. In the 1900s, there were 5 tetrads, 5 times when the total eclipses occurred in 6-month cycles. But there were only these, well, 2 times, there are 2 times in the 1900s when they started at Passover time. The other time was in 1967. In 1967, when and it was the year that the Jews fought the 6-Day War. Now, I can read, and lots of you have seen some of the videos about things that happened during the 6-Day War and the 1973 war, which is the Yom Kippur War. Haven't you? Haven't you seen that? And the Jews, who were vastly outnumbered, the Israelis, defeated the Arabs. I never saw one account where the Arabs said they backed off because they saw these blood moons. But they did back off because they saw other things. I mean, a massively superior Arab troop would go against a small, piddly Israeli thing, but they would back off and run in fear because they didn't just see that small Arab or small Israeli band. Yahweh showed them something else that scared the pants off them. And you see that over and over and over again in the accounts of this war. So just keep that in mind. And in the 1967 to 1968 tetrad, only one of the 4 eclipses was seen in Israel, or could be seen in Israel. Only one. So, or in the Arab world. So who's that sign for? Okay. So here we have, so they've concluded then from these tetrads and these events that they tie to something that is big is going to happen this year with Israel, and some are saying, get ready for the rapture. They are. There will be a tetrad, as I say, beginning with an eclipse on the Jewish Passover, Yahweh's first day of unleavened bread, and ending with tabernacles, according to the Jews in 2015, on their tabernacles, but it will be a month earlier than ours, than Yahweh's. Only one of these 4 eclipses will be visible in Jerusalem and Europe. Only one of them. Now, one of the writers of one of these books about the tetrad said, well, that doesn't matter as long as they occur. So we got into this discussion. If a tree falls in the forest and nobody is around, does it make any sound if nobody is there to hear it? And our brother Ron says, well, of course it does. And so I say this, okay, if there is an eclipse and it's a sign from Yahweh to a certain people, if nobody sees it, is it still a sign? I mean, how many times have people gone through a stop sign and they get pulled over and the cop says, well, you went through that stop sign. Well, I didn't see it. I didn't see it. I mean, they're still held accountable. But is that what Yahweh does? I mean, if it wasn't visible, I mean, people have gotten off because the stop sign was covered with a branch or, all undergrowth and overgrowth and all that. But is that the way our Yahweh is? If he is going to give a sign, is he going to give it where the people who it's meant for can't see it? That doesn't make any sense. That doesn't make any sense at all. And, you want to pick out events. Are those the three greatest events in the history of the Jewish quote-unquote people? Well, what about the birth of the Messiah? Or the death of the Messiah? There were no tetrads 100 years either side. What about, do all of those three events, do they pale into significance, the birth and the death of Messiah and the destruction of the temple in 70 AD? And the Bar Kokhba rebellion put down in 135? There are no eclipses even anywhere near those things. Now, there were eclipses a year after there was an eclipse, the year after Yeshua was born. And the way we know that is because Josephus witnessed it. Now, if that eclipse had not been visible in Israel, could Josephus tell us about that? How would he know? He wouldn't know. He had to see that. And that was a sign, but not of the Messiah's birth, as much as it was a marker for when Herod died, so that we would know when Yeshua was born, approximately, in 5 BCE. Okay, what about some of these other events? What about the Holocaust? I mean, the Holocaust from, 1930, beginning about 1939 through 45, and yet we had to wait 4 more years for the tetrad. They don't mention that as being a marker for the Holocaust. And if the Six-Day War in 1967 was such a major event that required a tetrad, what about the 1973 Yom Kippur War? What about that one? And we have the same thing reported for that war. Every time Israel goes to war, we have Arabs who will come back and say, well, the reason we ran is because we saw something there. Sometimes, I don't know if they always tell us what they saw. But whatever it is, it's something scary. And it makes them retreat. What does a sign, I ask you this. This is probably the most important question of the day. What does a sign from Yahweh really look like? Is it just some natural occurrence that can be predicted forward for hundreds of years or reconstructed backward for a few thousand years? Are those signs from Yahweh? And they can do that with all of these eclipses. And so which ones are signs from Yahweh? And which ones aren't? Because they occur all the time. All the time. There were 4 tetrads in the 1400s, by the way. But there's only one tetrad that's picked out as a sign from Yahweh, and that's because it was a year following something that happened for Jewish people. Is it something that has to be seen to be a sign from Yahweh to those who intended to be warned? How would you answer that question? If it's a sign from Yahweh, that's that question, if the tree falls in the woods and there's nobody around, does it make a sound? If it's a sign from Yahweh, could it be a sign from Yahweh if the people that it's intended for can't see it? How could that be a sign from Yahweh? I mean, that defies logic, doesn't it? So let's look at some scriptures that give us clues to understanding Yahweh's signs.
Think of the Kippurim, or the Teruah and the hurricane.
Yeah. Yes. The which one was that now? The
Karen, the horn.
Karen, yes, the one that we had, the last hurricane that we had in the Gulf that was supposed to come smashing through here, called Karen, which means horn in Hebrew, on the feast of Yom Teruah, the feast of the horn. Now that's kind of like a sign for us, but it wasn't a sign for anybody else out here in the world. But somehow that was a sign for us. I do believe. Okay, now let's look at some scriptures then that give us a clue to Yahweh's signs. Matthew 24, and they like to go here. They do use this scripture. And obviously, by the way, you can pull up maps, global maps of the world, and you can see where these four are going to occur. Let me see if I can find the right charts. That's 1494. Here is 2014. The one that starts this, the tetrad that starts this, the heart of this, the very center of this eclipse is about, let's see, how many miles is that? I can't tell. Probably a few hundred miles west of the Galapagos. I know you know where the Galapagos are. And Bob knows where Galapagos is. Yeah. It's off the west coast of South America. And that first eclipse of this tetrad will not be able to be visible in Israel or Europe, pretty much. Spanish people might see a hint of it, but Israel and the Arab world, it's not going to be there. Now, how can that be a sign for Israel? Israel's not going to see it. And you can pull these up, by the way, on the NASA site, because the Royal Astronomical Society of Canada Observer's Handbook has these, and these are available online. All you have to do is type in total lunar eclipse history, and you'll be able to access these charts that show you where the center of the eclipse is, and then people on either side of it, some people are going to be able to see it all, even several hundred miles east and west, but some people ain't going to see nothing. And the ones that are not going to see anything for that first eclipse are from China to East Africa. And Israel is right in the middle of that. There's no way. Now, I'll tell you what, if Israel can see this eclipse, that will be a sign from Yahweh. Because naturally, scientifically, it's not going to happen. Okay? The eclipse for tabernacles, pretty much the same thing. It centers right about, the center of it is right about Hawaii. So from Pakistan all the way through, nobody in Europe is going to see it at all. Nobody in the Arab world. Now, that isn't to say that there are not Islamic people who are going to see it, because it'll be visible in Borneo and in Indonesia, what we used to call Indonesia. I think it's called something else now. Japan. I mean, those people will be able to see some of this at the end of it. But if you want to see the whole thing, you better go to Hawaii. Okay? Then the next one, which is supposedly on their Passover, a little bit of the Arab world will see it, but Israel ain't going to see it. Most of Europe, not going to see it. And then finally, the fourth one comes around, and Israel will be able to see the last one. And it's going to be centered just off the east coast of South America. You could tell me where that is. That big country is Brazil, isn't it? So just off the north coast of Brazil. And now that's interesting, isn't it? And in, like I said, in the 1960s, that one was not very visible in Israel either. So let's go to Matthew 24, because here's where we're getting some of this. Matthew 24, beginning in verse 15. The disciples, you're very familiar with this, the disciples had asked Yeshua what would be the sign of his coming. And he goes through a whole scenario, wars and rumors of war, many will stumble, and so forth. And in verse 15, he says, so when you see the abomination that lays waste. Now, do you catch that? When you see. Now, if the abomination of desolation is laid waste and nobody sees it, what good is that? You got it? You get what I'm saying here? Okay, when you see the abomination that lays waste, spoken of by Daniel the prophet, set up in the set-apart place, where on this earth could there be a set-apart place? There isn't one right now. Only in Jerusalem. It's the only place. So doesn't the scripture pretty much tell us signs from Yahweh that have to do with the end time are going to be seen in Jerusalem? All right? He who reads, let him understand. Then those who are in Judea. Where's Judea? Isn't that Israel today? That's where it is. Flee to the mountains. Let him who is on the housetop not come down to take whatever out of his house. See, this stuff is associated with the rapture. And let him who is in the field not turn back to get his garments. Going to be raptured. Woe to those who are pregnant and to those who are nursing children in those days. Pray that your flight does not take place in winter or on the Shabbat. And we just heard last week that, yes, they do have winter in Israel. And they had, 25 inches of snow or something, probably a week ago. For then shall be great distress, or the King James says great tribulation, and this is what they're looking at, such as has not been since the beginning of the world until this time, no, nor ever shall be. Now, those Jews that went through the Holocaust in those prison camps, I'd say they had some tribulation. And this says this is going to be the worst. And if those days were not shortened, no flesh would be saved alive, but for the sake of the chosen ones, those days shall be shortened. If anyone says to you, look, here's the Messiah, or there, do not believe. And we're going to come back to this verse at the end. For false messiahs and false prophets shall arise, and they shall show great signs and wonders, so as to lead astray, if possible, even the chosen ones. See, I have forewarned you. See if I haven't read too far here, have I? I have forewarned you. So if they say, look, he is in the desert, don't go looking out there. Look, he's in the inner rooms, don't believe it. For as the lightning comes from the east and shines to the west, so also shall the coming of the Son of Adam be. For wherever the dead is, there the eagle shall be gathered together. And immediately after the distress of those days, wow, let me see, here it is, January 26th, and this tetrad starts on Passover Day, or first day of unleavened bread, and that's only, how many days away is that? Let's see, we got 28 days in February, 31 in March, because this is going to be in April. How many? Are there even 70? 31, 20, 50, around 70, 70-ish, close, 70 days. So between now and that first tetrad, according to these people, Good grief, we're going to have tribulation like you never believed. Right? Because immediately after, and it's all going to be over at Passover this year. So if we can just tough it out, folks. Immediately after the distress of those days, the sun shall be darkened, and the moon shall not give its light, and the stars shall fall from the heaven, and the powers of the heaven shall be shaken. Well, wait a minute. This was supposed to have happened in 1493 and 4, 1949 and 50, 1963, 60. I was alive then, and for the last couple of those. Of course, I probably wasn't too aware in 1950 because I was only 5 years old, but did anybody see the earth shaken or the heavens shaken? Most of you were alive in 1967, not 63, 67. Did your parents ever tell you about the earth being shaken? The heavens being shaken? And then the sign of the son of Adam shall appear in the heaven, and all the tribes of the earth shall mourn, and they shall see the son of Adam coming on the clouds of the heavens with power and much esteem. And he shall send his messengers with a great sound of a trumpet, and they shall gather together his chosen ones from the four winds, and we will have the rapture. It's coming. But then it says in verse 36, but concerning that day and the hour, no one knows, not even the messengers of the heavens, but my Father only. But Mr. Hagee knows.
You forget, we have our own, very own domestic terrorist in the White House. It could all happen this time.
Yeah, okay. Well, I think we've had our own very own terrorists in the White House. The airwaves are full of it for a lot more than just 6 years. A lot more than 6 years. They've been lying to us for many more years than 6. Okay, now let's go to Luke 21. So let's go to Luke 21. And let's pick it up in verse 27. This is the same, or verse 20, I'm sorry. This is the same account now. Pretty much. It's a parallel account to what we were reading in Matthew 24. And verse 20, Luke 21, verse 20. And when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, again, here's another clue that whatever signs there are going to be, you're going to be able to see them in Israel, Jerusalem specifically. Then know that its laying waste is near. Then let those in Judea flee to the mountains. Let those who are in the midst of her go out, and let not those who are in the fields enter her. Because these are the days of vengeance, to fill all that has been written. And there shall be signs in the sun and moon and stars, and on the earth anxiety of nations. Well, we've got that, but we've had that for many, many years. In bewilderment at the roaring of the sea and agitation, which we could have that. Men fainting from fear and the expectation of what is coming on the earth, for the powers of the heavens shall be shaken. Now, why would they be fainting if it was predictable and predicted by men of science? Well, we all should be shaking in our boots, shouldn't we? Then, in verse 27, then they shall see the Son of Adam coming in a cloud with power and much esteem. All right, let's go back to Old Testament, Joel. Joel chapter 2. Joel chapter 2. In your notes, Joe, by the way, is an abbreviation for Joel. Joel chapter 2, beginning in verse 27. Now, what we're reading is what signs from Yahweh, what the billboard of Yahweh really looks like. Okay? Joel 2:27. And you shall know that I am in the midst of Israel. Well, how are you going to know if you don't See the signs in Israel. And that I am Yahweh your Elohim, and there is no one else, and my people shall never be put to shame. And after this it shall be that I pour out my Ruach on all flesh, and your sons and your daughters shall prophesy, your old men dream dreams, your young men see visions, and also on the male servants and on the female servants I shall pour out my Ruach in those days. And I shall give signs in the heavens and upon the earth, blood and fire and columns of smoke. The sun is turned into darkness. Well, that sounds like an eclipse of the sun, doesn't it? Only problem, an eclipse of the sun is just like an eclipse of the moon. It's not seen everywhere. It's not that the eclipse will start here and everybody who's over here is going to see it as the sun comes to them. It doesn't happen that way. It's like the conjunction. It happens at a moment in time and lasts. How long does an eclipse last? No, it doesn't last 24 hours. The total eclipse only lasts maybe 4 minutes at the most, and then it begins to be a partial eclipse. And a partial eclipse can last for an hour, maybe 2, and I think maybe even as long as 3 hours. But not longer. And not everywhere. Only at that place where you happen to be when, if you happen to be there, where the eclipse takes place. So, it's going to be, how many of you have seen a total eclipse of the sun? Well, I hope you didn't look at it. But how many of you have lived through a total eclipse? Was it totally dark? It wasn't, was it?
That's the one where you have to have the cardboard.
Well, even with a partial, you're not supposed to ever look at the sun with your bare eyes. And the reason they tell you to shield your eyes is because in eclipse, I mean, we all see the sun every day. But if you just go out and stare at the sun, you'll go blind, even when there's not an eclipse. So the idea is that people are going to try to look at an eclipse. And so that's when you want to shield your eyes, because nobody in their right mind is going to go out and stare at the sun unless they want to be blind. Okay? So I don't know if the sun's rays are more dangerous there, or if it's just because people are going to look at it. People are going to stare at it, try to watch it.
The ones I seen in school, they told us how to make cardboard.
Yes, yeah, punch a little hole in it, right? Because if you're looking at it through a little hole, most of the sun's rays are being deflected, right? Okay, so almost everybody's seen a total eclipse, and nobody has seen darkness, not total darkness. It's kind of like a cloudy day, isn't it? Okay. And the moon turned into blood. Well, at an eclipse, the moon becomes blood. When we have certain atmospheric things going on and we have a full moon coming up, or even a moon, maybe a moon setting, and it gets down into the atmosphere of the earth, where the light's passing through the atmosphere, you can have a red moon, a blood moon. But this is something different than that, because this is something that Yahweh does. Does Yahweh have to use the natural phenomenon that we see in science to pull these things off? Yeah, that wouldn't be very strong Yahweh, would it? Okay, well, let's go on. You're going to see the sun turned into darkness, the moon into blood before the coming of the great and awesome day of Yahweh. And it shall be that everyone who calls on the name of Yahweh shall be delivered. For on Mount Zion and in Jerusalem there shall be an escape, as Yahweh has said, and among the survivors whom Yahweh calls. Do you think from that maybe the darkness will be visible in Israel, in Jerusalem, in Mount Zion? I think so. Now, let's go read the account in Acts chapter 2. It's the same account. He's quoting from Joel in Acts chapter 2, verse 17. And let's see if he changes anything. Acts 2:17. And it shall be in the last days, says Elohim, that I shall, says Elohim. Where did Elohim say that? In Joel 2. That's where he had it recorded. I shall pour out my ruach on all flesh, not even just the flesh in Jerusalem or on Mount Sinai. Mount Zion, not Sinai, Zion. And your sons and your daughters shall prophesy, your young men shall see visions, your old men shall dream dreams. And remember what we just read in Joel, everyone who calls on the name, not Jesus, not even Yeshua, Yahweh shall be saved, okay? Your sons, and also in verse 18, also on my male servants and on my female servants I shall pour out my spirit in those days, and they shall prophesy. I shall show wonders in the heaven above and signs in the earth beneath, blood and fire and vapor of smoke. In verse 20, the sun shall be turned into darkness and the moon into blood before the coming and great and splendid day of Yahweh. And it shall be that everyone who calls on the name Yahweh, which is correct, shall be saved, because that's a quote from Joel. So that's, I don't think that's an eclipse. I don't get an eclipse out of that. Revelation 6 and verse 12. Revelation chapter 6 and verse 12. Is this the same time? Revelation 6 and 12 says, and I looked when he opened the sixth seal and saw a great earthquake came to be, and the sun became black as sackcloth of hair, and the moon became as blood. Now, if you're saying, well, okay, it does seem from these scriptures that at least these signs have to be seen in Jerusalem, in Israel. Then maybe we could say, okay, this is kind of a local thing. All right? Where will these things happen? Will they just happen out in the middle of the Pacific Ocean? Or will these phenomenon be apparent worldwide? What's your guess? What's your guess? He says, all people. All people. I think he means all people are going to be able to see these things. Let's go to Exodus, which we're going to get into in just a few weeks, a couple weeks down the road, actually, because today we're starting in Exodus. Exodus chapter 10. Now, here's what a true miracle of Yahweh looks like. A true sign. And it is just that. It's a miracle. It's not some natural phenomenon that has been massaged to fit into a certain scenario. It's an actual miracle. Exodus chapter 10 and verse 21. Yahweh said to Moses, this is in the plagues, stretch out your hand toward the heaven, and let there be darkness over the land of Mitzrayim, even a darkness which is felt. How many of you said you were in a total eclipse? Or, were able to visit? Did you feel it? Anybody? I've never felt anything from the darkness of I've never even felt any, well, I guess you feel kind of creepy if it's a real dark, dark night. And that's what this darkness was like. It wasn't an eclipse, folks. There probably wasn't an eclipse that year. But if there was, it wasn't what Yahweh used. Because why? As we're going to see, it wasn't dark in Goshen. Did you ever stop to think of that? But, there are probably lots of commentaries who say, well, this was just a real deep eclipse. It was so deep that it didn't affect a few miles up in Goshen? And it lasted, as we're going to see, 3 days. Let's go on. So Moses stretched, in verse 22, Moses stretched out his hand toward the heavens, and there was thick darkness in all the land of Mitzrayim for 3 days. Now, if Yahweh wanted to cause an eclipse to last for 3 days, could he do it? Yeah, he would. Could he move that eclipse all over the face of the earth so that it happened everywhere? He could do that. He could do that. But I don't think that's what he did here. That would be a miracle in itself. It'd be a miracle if Yahweh could make an eclipse, if he would, he could make an eclipse last 3 days. But you know what? If he made an eclipse last 3 days, how did he make light in Goshen? I mean, any way you look at it, this is more than an eclipse. This is a miracle. This is how what signs look like. They did not see one another in Mitzrayim, nor did anyone rise from his place for 3 days, while all the children of Israel had light in their dwellings. Now, I don't know. I wasn't there, but I get the idea that, look, in Mitzrayim, if they even lit a candle, it was dark, because it was thick darkness. They couldn't even get light from a candle or from a lamp. That's a miracle. That's what Yahweh's signs look like, folks. That's what his billboard is like. Not like a series of 4 eclipses that they have to contrive. Now, if Yahweh does something and he causes that eclipse, like I say, and he could do it, he could cause that eclipse on the first day of unleavened bread to move around the earth so that everybody could see the sign. I don't expect, because that's not the way he has done these things. It's not. Let's look at some more. So how long does an eclipse last? How dark it is it, even if it's a total eclipse of the sun? This was not just some natural occurrence that Yahweh used, it was a miracle. Now Joshua and Israel had come into the land. Go back just after this occurrence in Egypt now, 40 years afterwards. They come into the land and they prepare to fight against the Amorites and several kings in the land, including the king of Jerusalem and several other of the cities. They had city kings. So there are probably 6 or 7 kings that they're preparing to fight. And here it is, it's just Joshua and his band. In verse 8 of Joshua chapter 10, Joshua chapter 10 and verse 8, and you're all familiar with this story. We've not read it in Torah readings, but we have read it, and we have discussed it, and you've heard it in Sunday school classes. Joshua's long day. Okay? Yahweh said to Yahshua, in verse 8 of Joshua 10, do not fear them, for I have given them into your hand. Remember, Yahweh calls those things that are not as though they were. Not one of them does stand before you. Now, this is the kind of thing that I submit to you that happened in the 1967 war and in the Yom Kippurim war and in the war that Israel fought in 1948, 49, 50. This is the kind of thing that happened. So Yahushua came up upon them suddenly, and having gone up all night from Gilgal, and Yahweh threw them into confusion, all those kings, before Israel. They smote them with great slaughter at Gibeon, and pursued them along the way that goes to Beth Horon, and smote them as far as Azekah and Mekhadah. And it came to be as they fled before Yahweh, and were on the descent of Beth Horon, that Yahweh threw down large hailstones from the heavens on them as far as Azekah, and they died. There were more who died from the hailstones than those whom the sons of Israel had slain with the sword. And Yahushua spoke to Yahweh in the day when Yahweh gave the Amorites over to the children of Israel, and he said before the eyes of Israel, sun, stand still over Gibeon, and moon in the valley of Ayalon. So the sun stood still, and the moon stopped. You know, I find it curious that nobody in science can ever find a time when this really happened. I mean, you know, they can find glitches in the time frame, but I mean, you just can't find times when all of a sudden the sun stops, the moon stops. What would happen what would that mean? If the sun stopped, it means that the earth would have to stop rotating. What would happen if that happened? Everything that we know would just collapse. We'd go flying off, somewhere into outer space, unless Yahweh does it. This is not some natural phenomenon that occurs every 5,000, 6,000 years. This was a bloody miracle from Almighty Yahweh. So the sun stood still in verse 13. The moon stopped till the nation avenged itself upon its enemies. Is this not written in the book of Jasher, which the book of Jasher that's extant today is probably not that book. Thus, the sun stopped in the midst of the heavens and did not hasten to go down for an entire day. Well, you say, the sun doesn't go down for an entire day now. It gets up in the morning and it doesn't go down until the end of the day. It's not what this day is. This is a 24-hour day. An entire day, day and night. It's a long day. Yeah. And there has been no day like that before it or after it that Yahweh listened to the voice of a man, because Yahweh fought for Israel. That's what a miracle, that's what a sign in the billboard looks like from Yahweh. In 2 Kings, here's another sign from Yahweh. It was given pretty much specifically just to a man, to one man. 2 Kings chapter 20 and verse 1. You remember this. King Hezekiah was sick unto death. And Yeshayahu the prophet, the son of Amoz, went to him and said to him, and this is the prophet Isaiah, thus says Yahweh, set your house in order, for you're going to die and not live. Wow. And in verse 6, here's where he turns his face to Yahweh, and he begs Yahweh. He pleads with Yahweh. Can Yahweh be persuaded? Is your prayer important? Yahweh says, I've heard your prayer, and I shall add to your days 15 years and deliver you and this city from the hand of the sovereign Ashur, and shall defend this city for my own sake and for the sake of Dawid my servant. And in verse 7, Yeshayahu said, take a cake of figs, and they took it and laid it on the boil. So he had some kind of a nasty boil, probably gangrene had set in, blood poisoning, something that was going to take his life imminently. So Yahweh told him what to do, and Hezekiah said to Yeshayahu, what is the sign that Yahweh does heal me, and that I shall go down up to the house of Yahweh the third day? There's that third day. It's like a resurrection from the dead, isn't it? Because he was as good as dead if Yahweh hadn't intervened. And Yeshayahu said, this is the sign for you from Yahweh, that Yahweh does the word which he has spoken. Shall the shadow go forward 10? It says degrees. That's not what the Hebrew says. I'm disappointed in the ISR people because they translated this degrees. It's steps. Steps. So when we read this, we think of a sundial and that the sun is going to move on the sundial. That's kind of like trickery. That wasn't what Hezekiah's or Ahaz's sundial was like. It wasn't a dial. It was steps. And you can go online and you can look up ancient ways of telling time, and they had a gizmo. I can just draw this for the people that are here. Built that had steps. And then there was a wall over here, and they had a space in here, and this was all done so they could use this to tell time. And then they had a wall here. And so I don't know how long these steps were, but this is what Isaiah told Hezekiah. Do you want the sun to go up a step, or 10 steps, actually? 10 steps? Or do you want it to go back? And I don't know how many steps they have. There are some pictures that you can see where they had a long staircase. It's a stairway. Do you want it to go up 10 steps or back 10 steps? This is not just, this is not just some little trickery thing here on a sundial, because it wasn't a sundial, it was steps. That's what the Hebrew says. It says it was steps. So do you want it to go forward 10 steps or backward 10 steps? You can look it up. And Hezekiah said, well, it'd be easy for the sun to go down 10 steps. No, but let the shadow go backward 10 steps. I mean, this was a significant change. This wasn't like just moving a little bit. And Yeshayahu the prophet cried out to Yahweh, and he brought the shadow 10 steps backward, by which it had gone down on the steps of Ahaz. And it's the same word, steps. So how they get sundial and degrees, it's just from their Western thinking, all right? So that's what it is. It's ma'akot in both places, and it's steps, all right? That's what a miracle from Yahweh looks like. What would happen, what has to happen for the shadow to go 10 steps either way? The earth has to change its rotation. Wow. You know what? It's not a natural phenomenon. It's a miracle. It's a miracle. Now let's go back to Matthew 27. Matthew 27. So this my friends, is what signs in the billboard from Yahweh look like. They're not just some little eclipse. By comparison, an eclipse is nothing. And the fact that there are 4 in a row, and it really kind of exposes the fallacy of these tetrads happens, and they're always 6 lunations apart. It just happens that this one starts on the Jewish Passover, or beginning of the Passover. On Yahweh's Feast of Unleavened Bread. And the second one is on Yahweh's Tabernacles. But the next 2 are really not. Not if we're right about the sun having to complete its cycle before you can take the first day of the month. It just doesn't work that way. And they all are like this. All tetrads are 6 lunations apart, and they float. They float about from one cycle or 2 cycles to the next 2 cycles. They float. As we look at our calendar. Matthew 27 and verse 45. Here's another one. Is this an eclipse? This is at the death of Yeshua. There's no record of a total eclipse. In the scientific record, they can't find an eclipse at this time. Okay? So here it is, at the time of Yeshua's death, from the 6th hour, which is about noon, because they're counting from dawn, about 6 a.m. for 6 hours, brings you to noon. There was darkness over all the land until the 9th hour, 3 o'clock in the afternoon. That's the 9th hour, because they were counting these hours from sunrise. Darkness, 3 hours, hardly ever is. It's very extremely rare for an eclipse to last 3 hours. This darkness lasted 3 hours. This is a miracle. This is a miracle. And about the 9th hour, Yeshua cried out with a loud voice, saying, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. That is, my El, why have you left me hanging here? It is finished. It's recorded in Luke 23, 44, and 45. Same thing. Darkness from the 6th hour till the 9th hour. Noon to 3 o'clock. Could Yahweh use an eclipse and extend it? Of course he could. But that is not what he has done. When Yahweh does a sign, it's not just something that a man can explain away by some natural phenomenon, and that's what a lot of people are going to do. And some people will say, well, that's what you're doing. Well, no, it's a natural phenomenon. I don't know what's going to happen, but guess what? There ain't going to be no rapture. Not this year, not next year. Not ever. Not ever. So, it's really the concoction of man on some natural phenomenon that gives them something to really stir people up. And I guarantee that somebody's going to make some money on this. Oh yeah. Oh yeah. So when Yahweh does it, it's not just some natural phenomenon. It's a miracle, and he does it. Why? So they will know. Did anybody know in 1493 and 94 that Yahweh was doing something and they were persecuting Yahweh's people? Did anybody really know in 1949 and 50? I never heard anything. Of course, I was a little kid. But did anybody really know in 49 and 50 that Yahweh was doing something? We didn't act like, as a nation, we didn't act like we knew, because we still supported the Arabs behind the back of Israel. I mean, you know the scenario. Did anybody really know in 1967 and 68 that those were signs from you? They didn't know in Israel because they didn't see him. Or they only saw one of the four. When Yahweh does it, he's going to do it so they will know. It will be a sign that everyone who is to get the message, to be warned, or whatever message he wants to give them, they'll see it. It's not going to be a sign that he's going to hide somewhere. And then come back and say, well, why didn't you pay attention to my sign? I know, I realize you didn't see it, but why didn't you pay attention to it? Just like, the cop who's going to try to give you a ticket because the stop sign was knocked over, was obliterated from foliage. Matthew 24 again, in closing. Matthew 24 and verse 24. For false messiahs and false prophets shall arise, and they shall show. Are they showing us signs? Yeah, they are, but whose signs are they? They shall show signs and wonders so as to lead astray, if possible, even the chosen ones. See, I have forewarned you. So if they say to you, look, he is in the desert, do not go out. Or look, he is in the inner rooms, do not believe. Yahweh, when he performs a sign, you will know it when it happens. Not 6 months ahead, except for the sign of the two witnesses. We will know that one. I don't see them yet. That's why I know there's not going to be anything like a rapture this year or next. And the tribulation, the real tribulation, has not started in earnest yet. Oh, we're poised for it, but it hasn't started in earnest. And it isn't going to happen. I don't care. It can start, but it isn't going to happen the 1st of February and be over by April. What's the date of that tetrad? April 15th? It's not going to be over that quick. It's going to last for 3.5 and another 3.5 years. So may Yahweh inform you, calm you, give you his peace, lift up his countenance over you, and give you all his blessings. Yivarekeka Yahweh vayishmereka. Ya'er Yahweh panavaleka vikaneka. Yasa Yahweh panavaleka v'yasem l'ka shalom.